Craig Gill is the assistant director and editor-in-chief of the University Press of Mississippi, and he will introduce Robert Luckett. Help me introduce.
Thank you very much, Chris, and I'd just like to reiterate how much we've enjoyed working with Archives and History over the years. It's been a long and fruitful relationship. And I won't take up much of your time because I'm not the reason that you're here. So we are here instead to listen to Robert E. Luckett, Jr., better known as Robby, who is Associate Professor of History and Director of the Margaret Walker Center for the Study of the African American Experience at Jackson State University. Robby has been at Jackson State for about 7 years now, and it's been my great pleasure to know him during that time and to work with him on this book, J.T. Patterson and the White South's Dilemma. And I just want to state for the record, as a working historian who is writing a book and is also an administrator and director of the Margaret Walker Center, Robby is a busy man, so we appreciate his work with us and also the work that he does at Jackson State and with the center. During his time at Jackson State, he has published numerous articles in a variety of scholarly journals. He has also published an essay in the book, The Civil Rights Movement in Mississippi, coincidentally also published by the University Press of Mississippi. That volume was a book that we were pleased to have him in, because I knew that as he was working on that, he was also working on this. And the editor's job is to ever so gently and ever so politely poke at the author repeatedly until such time as everything is done. And Robby took that poking with great aplomb, I have to say. So let me now stop, and I'm not going to try to tell you about the book itself because that's what Robby is here to do. I will make one last point since I stole this copy from over here. The book is available. There are copies available for sale here from Lemuria. There's a salesperson from Lemuria on the side wall over there. So if you want copies, if you want to purchase copies, or if you want copies signed, you have the author here as well. So having said that, let's all welcome Robby Luckett.
Thanks, everybody. It's good to be here. I see a lot of people in this room I have to thank for this project. And yes, Craig had to do a lot of poking. I began this sometime around, I believe, December of 2002. So it has been 13 years in the making. My good friend Carroll is here. She's now published 2 books, one on Theodore and the other on Margaret Walker. And she said the second book was much easier to write than the first. So anything has to be easier to write than something that takes 13 years to get done. So, but it was in December 2002, and I should first point out Bill Patterson, the son of J.T. Patterson, who's here, and Bill's son is with him today as well. By a chance encounter early on in my graduate school days at the University of Georgia, I met Bill at a Christmas party, and we got to talking, and I was interested in doing civil rights history and was working then on a project about Madison County and Annie Devine. And we got to talking. Of course, I knew who his dad was because essentially every major civil rights litigation of the era was, you know, the NAACP versus Joe Patterson in the state of Mississippi. So he was the named litigant and everything. And Bill informed me that he had a box of stuff from his dad's in his house and asked if I'd want to look at it. And I said, yes, please. And that launched this book, and there has been a lot of time and effort and things that have intervened over the last 13 years. It hasn't been one continuous process, but it all began thanks to Bill. I'm very grateful for that. And I would also say many of the images you're going to see today are in the book and came directly from Bill as well. And so I'm thankful for his support of this project over the long term. I feel like it's a little bit like the butt of that old joke about, did you finish summa cum laude or magna cum laude or cum laude? No, I just finished thank you laude. And I would also say my wife and my mother are very glad that this is So, as Mississippi's Attorney General from 1956 to 1969, which is generally speaking the breadth of what most people consider the modern civil rights movement, J.T. Patterson led the legal defense for the of Jim Crow in the state. And when I talk about Jim Crow, we're really talking about a system of social, economic, and political hegemony based around the social constructivist of race. Patterson, seen here on the right with his friend James B. Coleman and Tom Scarborough with the Sovereignty Commission, was inaugurated for office in 1956, just 2 months before the launching of the Sovereignty Commission, whose, quote, purpose was to protect the sovereignty of Mississippi from encroachment thereon by the federal government. That was a century-old, in fact, states' rights mantra that's probably familiar to most people here. And despite those dubious legal foundations, Patterson supported the Sovereignty Commission's mission from the start and served as an ex officio leader of it. And I should also say that much of the research for this book happened through the Sovereignty Commission papers and the files held here in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, and I owe all the staff members here a huge debt of gratitude for their support. I spent many hours in that reading room just across the way. In addition to his leadership on the Sovereignty Commission, Patterson was also, not surprisingly, a card-carrying member of the Citizens Council. And in his own words, had, quote, spent many hours and driven many miles advocating the basic principles for which the Citizens Councils were originally organized. These two groups, as I believe many of you know, were the brainchildren of elite, powerful, hardline segregationists, bitter enders, those who were willing to fight to the bitter end for the cause of Jim Crow. And because of Patterson's role in those two organizations, no one ever really doubted his Jim Crow credentials, at least until September of 1962. Because it was in that fall that Patterson stepped out of his historical mold and defied the circle of white power brokers amongst whom he had been entrenched in Mississippi's hierarchy. And he did so at the time of perhaps the biggest crisis for Mississippi's racist order. From the time that James Meredith filed his application to Ole Miss in January 1961, Patterson stood on the front line of the state's defense. And even after the U.S. Supreme Court decreed that Meredith must enter the university, Patterson continued to work to oppose the school's desegregation and federal intervention. But he faced what I call a dilemma that confronted all white Southerners. And that was a pretty simple question. How do white Southerners maintain an artificial, elevated position in Southern society without resorting to the violence or intimidation that had propped up white power for 3 centuries? And really, white power was propped up and built upon violence and a history of violence, going back to slavery, which was, of course, an inherently violent system. I was talking to a group of students yesterday, and we were talking about the Black Power movement and why so many people couldn't disassociate, particularly white people in this country, couldn't disassociate the Black Power movement from violence. And that was because in American history, power has always been predicated upon violence. And so when people talked about Black Power, most whites in this country felt like they were talking about black violence, even when that wasn't the case. But power built upon violence or intimidation. And if it can't be built upon violence or intimidation, Patterson and others had to figure out a way to try and maintain it. Once the Supreme Court handed down Meredith v. Fair in 1962, the state attorney general had to look and figure out how to temper the impact of that ruling without joining the mob that would gather on the campus in Oxford. And in the wake of Meredith's integration, all of you know, riots erupted on the university campus. Most white Mississippians held that institution in reverence, and still do, I would say, as it was a symbol of their status, constructed upon white supremacy. And Meredith's entrance threatened deep-seated notions of white privilege. That threat prompted an expression of white fear and outrage that led to the violent clash with federal marshals and the deaths of 2 people. After that crisis, Roy Wilkins, executive secretary of the NAACP, blasted the state for its history of racist violence and lack of official intervention at Ole Miss. Quote, "We call Mississippi our worst state. It is not representative of America. Our task is as much to bring Mississippi whites into the 20th century as it is to secure justice for the Negro." That's a comment that was laced with the bitterness and frustration of an exhausted activist. But Wilkins's words also represent a point of general agreement among civil rights activists and scholars. White Mississippi's exceptionalism for its racial hatred and the depth of its commitment to opposing the quest for racial equality. That is generally the narrative accepted in American history. And for good reason. The notion of Mississippi's singular racial extremism has held consistent sway. This was a dangerous place to live and be black and or an activist. But I would argue, and my book argues, that that fact obscures some complex trends in the white community. The argument for Mississippi's racial extremism, exceptionalism. Patterson's career, now, I would just note really quickly, this is his staff photo in 1956. Just remember the size of the staff here, 7 members. This will certainly change by the 1960s, the size of the Attorney General's office. Patterson's career allows us a localized inspection of Jim Crow. Again, that social, political, and economic system of power. Much in the same way that historians like John Dittmer, whose book Local People really launched me into wanting to be a civil rights historian, much in the way local people have been used to better understand the complexities of the modern civil rights movement, we can use similar analysis to understand the complexities of segregation in Jim Crow. While most white Mississippians were committed to the cause of white hegemony, and many were willing to employ any means necessary, there was never in this state, at any point in time, a total consensus on how best to maintain that power. Instead of a monolithic white South that all acted with an exceptional racial extremism, the adherents to Jim Crow disagreed over the means to ultimately, generally the same racist ends. If all white Mississippians, I argue, had been the same in their commitment to racial extremism and their commitment to violence to enforce their hegemony, the civil rights movement would have made greater gains, because the bad guys in that case would be a lot easier to identify. If someone is shooting you or threatening you, you know who they are. But in fact, it was much more complex than that. It didn't mean that they weren't dangerous, that is for sure. But it certainly would have made for easier targets in the movement. But the bad guys didn't always announce themselves. They didn't always use the demagogic rhetoric that became so associated in Mississippi with the likes of Ross Barnett and James K. Vardaman and Theodore Bilbo. I love this picture of Vardaman because he just looks like an evil supervillain with that cape. And in fact, a lot of Patterson's political philosophy came from the other United States senator who operated this time that I'm sure some of you know, but while most Americans can recall the names of Vardaman and Bilbo, Pat Harrison, who was U.S. Senator, who defeated Vardaman, and who, when he was up for Senate Majority Leader during the New Deal, lost that by 1 vote due to the fact that the other member of the Senate from the state of Mississippi voted against him, Theodore Bilbo, which is a little known fact, something that would rarely happen today, right? Someone from your own party in your own state voting against you for Senate Majority Leader. And I joked at the Mississippi Book Festival a couple of weeks ago too, with Theodore Bilbo, that if any of you were there in the morning when the Jackson State Band, the Sonic Boom of the South, came marching down the front steps, that the Theodore Bilbo statue inside the state capitol spontaneously imploded. But not all leaders in the state of Mississippi were like Vardaman or Bilbo or Ross Barnett. And they didn't commit themselves to white supremacy through violence, through spectacle lynchings, through the murders of people like Emmett Till. And I just think it's important that we remember Emmett Till 60 years after his death, a boy at 14 who should still be alive today. I know that there's nobody in this room who's approaching 74 years old. Y'all are all much too young for that. But that would be Emmett Till's age today, were he with us. But they didn't all commit those atrocities. They didn't all espouse those atrocities. They may have enabled them in many ways. The deaths of people like George Lee and Medgar Evers and Vernon Dahmer, and too many others to begin listing here. But we need to understand the differences in white strategies for opposing black advancement and recognize what were often really the savvy methods employed by whites for doing so. And to do that is to have a more complicated and complete understanding of what African Americans were up against. In fact, I would argue that even more credit is due activists who fought the racist power structure in Mississippi and throughout the rest of the South than what we currently give them, for many reasons, particularly the complexity of what they were up against. And James Meredith's integration in 1962 of Ole Miss marked a major turning point in that story, as the staunchest defenders of the Jim Crow South faced a major defeat. Those like Ross Barnett who'd drawn a line in the sand were seeing that line crossed. Again, the central question became how far members of the white hierarchy were willing to go to maintain segregation and their racist power. While Ross Barnett and the Citizens Council allowed and even encouraged, again, I would argue, violence to erupt at Ole Miss, people like Joe Patterson, seen here with a number of political leaders, including, again, his friend James P. Coleman, and I would point out Frank Smith, people who would be described often as kind of the moderate segregationist voices in Mississippi. Frank Smith is standing second from the right. People like that and Joe Patterson, who may not have been any less committed to the cause of white supremacy, were willing to bend in order to maintain as much of their power as possible in the face of a battle that they realized that they could not win. For Patterson, one black student at Ole Miss did not mean that the university was integrated. And he realized that Meredith would face violent repercussions, as he well did, as well as the fact of being resegregated within the university that he had worked so hard to break into. The fact that James Meredith finished at Ole Miss did not mean that it was easy once he got there. Meredith first inquired about admission into Ole Miss before the spring term of 1961. In a letter to the registrar, Robert Ellis, Meredith requested an application, a catalog, and other information. Surprisingly, he received such in a generic but polite form letter that was sent to all prospective students. Meredith wrote back to Mr. Ellis, thanked him, and announced, "I sincerely hope that your attitude toward me as a potential member of your student body reflects the attitude of the school and that it will not change upon learning that I am not a white applicant." That revelation definitely changed things for James Meredith. And on June 8, 1961, the NAACP's Legal Defense and Educational Fund team of R. Jess Brown, Constance Baker Motley, and Thurgood Marshall, and I think it's great to see, particularly Constance Baker Motley and R. Jess Brown, one of the really unsung local heroes of the movement. That legal team filed an initial complaint against Charles Fair, president of the Board of Trustees of Institutions of Higher Learning, claiming that Meredith had, in fact, been denied admission because of his race, contrary to the dictates of the 14th Amendment. When Meredith v. Fair made it to trial in late January 1962, after what was quite a bit of obfuscation and delay, Attorney General Joe Patterson led the team of state lawyers, as mentioned before, in the fight to maintain segregation at Ole Miss. The defendant's position was that Meredith had been denied admission on 4 grounds, supposedly irrespective of race. 1, his inability to produce the required 5 letters of recommendation from alumni, a policy that had been instituted in November 1954 as a response to Brown. And of course, the only alumni prior to 1954 were white, and there was no way James Meredith was going to be able to get 5 letters of recommendation. 2 and 3 are related. University policy in regard to transfer students from colleges not belonging to regional accrediting associations and the school's rules about transfers of credits from such colleges, which referred to Meredith's years at Jackson State, which at the time was not SACS accredited, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, but soon would be after he had applied for admission. And 4th, and this is really important in terms of James Patterson's role in the case, evidence which included Meredith's service record and a charge pending against him of illegal voter registration that indicated that he was a bad character risk and a potential troublemaker on campus. The last point revolved on a moral turpitude clause in the admission standards for Ole Miss. In that sense, they claimed that Meredith had been denied by the registrar due to a failure in his character rather than his race. A story in the Tupelo Daily Journal ran with a headline that says, Ole Miss registrar says Meredith, apparent troublemaker, psychotic. So you can get the point. And in reality, Meredith was a troublemaker, right? I mean, he had to be, in that he sought to undermine a fundamental part of the Jim Crow power structure. But this idea of what was a fraudulent and false charge of fraudulent voter registration, of voter fraud, came up repeatedly, and will be the centerpiece, really, of this story. Of course, you also had the question of states' rights, and that was never far from Joe Patterson's mind or arguments. In a letter to constituents, he wrote, "I do not think the federal government has any right or authority whatsoever to attempt to supervise the administration of state-owned colleges, high schools, or grade schools." But he didn't have much choice. On September 10th, 1962, Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black, acting on behalf of a unanimous Supreme Court, enjoined any further efforts to prevent Meredith from attending Ole Miss, and in turn, the Justice Department announced that they were ready to bring him to campus with U.S. Marshals by his side. Patterson, for his part, in turn condemned the Kennedy administration, at one point calling Robert Kennedy in the press a jackass. He said, "It's a sad commentary in American history when the United States Attorney General ceases to be the Attorney General of all the United States and permits his office to become General Counsel for the NAACP, Martin Luther King, and other radical agitators and troublemakers." Rhetoric that was pretty common for white political leaders of the day. But even Patterson would be taken aback by what was the assault launched on federal authority by Ross Barnett in front of a statewide television audience, which some of you may have witnessed. In what was a long and winding address, Barnett told state officials, quote, "I speak to you now in the moment of our greatest crisis since the war between the states. An ambitious federal government employing naked and arbitrary power has decided to deny us the right of self-determination in the conduct of the affairs of our sovereign state." He blamed, quote, "professional agitators, an unfriendly liberal press, and other troublemakers. We must either submit to the unlawful dictates of the federal government or stand up like men and tell them never." Clearly drawing that line in the sand. But despite those remarks, which certainly stirred the hearts of racist extremists throughout the state and throughout the South, over the next several days, Barnett and Robert Kennedy choreographed Meredith's arrival, unbeknownst to most of the people of the state. Now, that dialogue between Barnett and Kennedy is famous. All of that is available. It was, of course, recorded. But Kennedy made one big mistake. He trusted Ross Barnett, which is a pretty bad mistake. When Barnett asked Attorney General Patterson to take over those negotiations and work on a deal with the Kennedy Justice Department to bring Meredith to Oxford to register, unbeknownst to the Attorney General Patterson, Barnett quietly went into conference with his closest confidants, mostly Citizens Council operatives, to figure out how to secretly proceed. Now, after all other legal options had been exhausted, Patterson had been ready, prepared to admit Meredith, again with the assumption that one black student at Ole Miss did not make it an integrated university, and assuming that he had no choice but to uphold the dictates of the Supreme Court. He didn't want to risk a battle like what had been seen in Little Rock. He didn't think that he was backing down from his long-held racist views, but as he saw it, creating a direct confrontation with the federal government would only make matters worse for the segregationist cause. With that in mind, but unaware of the governor's plans, Patterson started to make some headway with the Justice Department's Burke Marshall, who was an old adversary and actual, surprisingly, friend of the families. In a relatively cordial conversation with Marshall during this time, Patterson joked that he had not talked with the Assistant U.S. Attorney General for Civil Rights in a long time. "I haven't been out of the state much, you won't let me." To which Marshall retorted, "You could say that we are keeping each other busy," which is certainly the case. Marshall did let Patterson know that he was on an open speaker with other high-ranking Justice Department officials, including James McShane, head of the U.S. Marshal Service, who would eventually accompany Meredith to campus. And they wanted to talk about arranging Meredith's hopefully peaceful arrival on campus the next day with Patterson and the state's public safety commissioner, someone many of you probably remember, T.B. Birdsong, who was also on the line with this phone call. The idea here is that, at least initially, Meredith would be brought to campus There would be a type of stand in the schoolhouse door, like had been done at the University of Alabama. Then the federal marshals would show up and essentially clear the way so that Ross Barnett and others could save face, and that Meredith could then enter. They could say that they stood up and were forced aside by the federal government. This was the initial plan. The state, for its part, had to agree to quote unquote safe passage for Meredith when he got to campus and he left. Patterson assured Marshall that Meredith would be protected. And in addition, he agreed to allow McShane as head of the U.S. Marshal Service and 1 or 2 deputies to accompany Meredith through the gates of Ole Miss. Marshall asked General Patterson about how many men will Colonel Birdsong have. Indulging the question, Patterson replied, "Let's put it this way, Mr. Marshall, he will have all that are necessary." It's not the way it exactly turned out. Relieved, Marshall thanked Patterson for being, as always, very cooperative and direct. With the situation being settled then, at least to the satisfaction of both sides who were on that phone, Patterson gave Marshall his home telephone number in case anything came up. Later that night, when Patterson informed the governor of the arrangements, there was a hitch. 2 of Patterson's assistant attorneys general, remember the staff photo from 1956? This is 1964. It has grown exponentially. 2 of his assistant attorneys general, Ed Cates and Dugas Shands, and Dugas Shands is sitting to the left of Joe Patterson, second from the left, who were renowned racists, and many people here probably remember that as well. And I would say as well, I had the great opportunity of interviewing 2 members of this staff, Delos Burks, who's standing second from the left, and Bill Lane, who's standing far to the right, who, of course, you remember. Together, Ed Cates and Dugas Shands, with Barnett's closest advisor, Tom Watkins, devised a secret plan with the governor. And the plan, which very few people know about, still very few people know about, was to call a special session of the Mississippi legislature the night before Meredith was set to come to Oxford. Again, Patterson had agreed to, at least to his safe passage while he was in Oxford. At 1 a.m. on September 20th, the governor signed Senate Bill number 1501, declaring that anyone with, quote, a criminal charge of moral turpitude pending against him or her was ineligible to attend the state's colleges or universities, and anyone knowingly enrolling a person so disqualified or aiding or abetting such an enrollment would be guilty of a misdemeanor and subject to a fine not exceeding $300 or imprisonment for 1 year in the county jail or both. Remember the charge of voter fraud that was hanging out there against Meredith? That legislation was suspiciously well timed, since on that same day, Meredith was convicted of fraudulent voter registration in absentia, right? He wasn't even told that he was going to be facing those charges. So he was convicted that day that the legislation has passed of fraudulent voter registration, charged $500 plus court costs, and sentenced to 1 year in prison. Instead of simply doing a stand in the schoolhouse door that day, Barnett planned to arrest Meredith, and after arresting him, then by state law, having reason to permanently keep him out of Ole Miss. The part of the story that few people know. He would have legal cause to reject Meredith's application. But Barnett didn't expect what happened next. After the governor signed the law, he conferred with the Board of Trustees in Patterson in a late night meeting. There, the board turned over its power to Barnett. They did so that they could clear themselves of legal wrongdoing, since the governor would be solely responsible for standing in the schoolhouse door, making the stand. No one at that meeting, Patterson included, had any idea about the governor's actual plan to arrest Meredith for the conviction of voter fraud. Upon learning the news, you can imagine that the members of the board were all too happy to have given their power over to the governor, because they knew that they would be facing serious ramifications, although the Board of Trustees of Institutions of Higher Learning soon regretted that decision, because Sachs threatened to not renew the state's accreditation for its colleges and schools due to the unwarranted procedures and political interference. So ultimately, Sachs didn't take any action against the state's colleges, But Patterson didn't just stand idly by. Instead, he was amazed at the governor's cunning. The Attorney General did not want to be a pawn in the plot that was going to force President Kennedy to act against the state of Mississippi. Patterson realized that that was a losing cause for the Jim Crow hierarchy. One of Patterson's assistants, Bill Lane, in an interview with me, and I do believe everybody knows he was our future governor and Attorney General, Bill Lane called what Patterson did next the greatest act of political courage that he had ever seen. Now, whether it was courageous or not, we can debate that. But what Patterson did do is that he turned around after the governor announced his plan to arrest Meredith, informed him that he was, in order to keep Ole Miss segregated, quote, willing to make any personal sacrifice except for my personal and professional integrity. He didn't have any desire to help Meredith get into Ole Miss. That wasn't his goal. But he knew that if the governor's plan moved forward, that Jim Crow Mississippi could take a damning blow. Particularly, he knew that it would provoke federal intervention and future success for the civil rights movement. He also knew that if he did anything about the governor's plan, that he could threaten his own political future. And yet, the next morning, again, all of this is happening in the middle of the night, the next morning, Patterson woke up and immediately called Burke Marshall in the Kennedy Justice Department. When Patterson reached Marshall, the Attorney General apologized but insisted that he had nothing to do with what he was about to tell him. Quote, I have no control. I will not be able to assure you of the things I thought I could yesterday when I spoke with you. I regret it with all my heart, and I want you to know that it is a thing over which I have no control at all. The only thing I could do was frankly to call you and to let you know what the situation was. In the end, Patterson told Marshall all about the governor's plans to arrest Meredith and that he wouldn't, in fact, be able to maintain safe passage while on campus. Now, of course, that safe passage was less than guaranteed about 10 days later, but this moment of a segregationist political power figure in Mississippi picking up the phone to call a member of the Kennedy Justice Department and to inform him that Ross Barnett is about to basically stab them in the back, arrest Meredith, and keep him out of Ole Miss permanently, it's a pretty shocking moment. There's not very many white Southern political leaders who are willing to go that far and do something like that. And Patterson certainly was taking his career in his hands to do so. And so, with that, the wheels got set in motion. Robert Kennedy himself gets on the phone with Joe Patterson and they work out a new plan. And of course, not surprisingly, Ross Barnett waffled on his pledge to maintain the peace and eventually indicated what was his supposed inability to control a crowd that had grown to mob-like proportions when word spread over the weekend in Oxford that Meredith was prepared to actually register on Sunday, September 30th. And he did, escorted by 500 armed U.S. Marshals and 12,000 federalized troops who were standing by and would eventually occupy the campus and the university that day. And again, we know 2 men were left dead as bigots laid siege to the campus. Now, to come back to the book, that violence, that story of the Ole Miss crisis has played a central and prominent role in the histories of the Meredith crisis. And they've played prominent roles in popular memory of the integration of Ole Miss. And I would say most of you and most people in general understand that Barnett's actions stood at the heart of what transpired with the violence and the deaths. But Meredith's cause might have been doomed, and that's the part that few people know, if not for the behind-the-scenes efforts of a segregationist, Joe Patterson. This is him with other Southern Attorney Generals, including on the far right, Jack Vermillion from Louisiana. Without Patterson's interference and reluctant assistance with Meredith's commission, Barnett may have succeeded in keeping Meredith out of Ole Miss, and the future tenor of Jim Crow rhetoric and action opposing the advancing modern movement would have been altered. In that sense, Patterson's story recasts how the Meredith crisis has come to be understood. It shifts some attention away from the banner between Barnett and the Kennedys and from the deadly riots. Instead, a relatively obscure state-level official became a historical actor of national import that very few people know about. In this way, Patterson's story supplements the impulse, I would argue, in civil rights scholarship over the past 20 years to rewrite the popular narrative from a top-down national story in terms of a local grassroots conflict with complicated characters. After the crisis, Patterson certainly did face political repercussions. He described, quote, a small band of zealots who had taken resistance beyond the law in Oxford and who were then searching for a scapegoat. And they set their eyes upon Joe Patterson. Blaming Patterson for Meredith's successful registration, some extremists even moved to impeach the Attorney General for his role in the Meredith crisis, even though at the same exact time as Attorney General, he was having to defend both Ross Barnett and Paul Johnson in contempt of court cases with the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and also suing the Justice Department to remove those 12,000 federal troops that had come to occupy the Ole Miss campus. And I love this picture. Carroll Gartin, Jim Eastland just looks really unhappy in this picture. and Carroll Gartin looks like he's talking to Joe Patterson, asking, what do you think's wrong with Big Jim? And I think Patterson's telling him, just leave him alone. Just leave him alone. But even Paul Johnson, when he's elected governor, is elected essentially as the lieutenant governor who stood by Ross Barnett. But the day he gives his inaugural address, he takes a remarkably moderate stand announcing that Mississippi must remember that it's part of the Union, which doesn't seem that crazy, but in 1965 it certainly was for Mississippi's governor to announce that fact. And I would argue that the Meredith crisis is the turning point where you see the evolution in segregationist policies and politics away from the Barnett brand of hardline massive resistance to a much, I would argue, more difficult brand of resistance to tackle. A brand that some scholars have called colorblind resistance. Resistance that did not talk about race or racism or racist practices, but in fact was all about racialized power. A good example would be Freedom of Choice, authored in large part in Mississippi by Joe Patterson. Freedom of Choice was the plan to desegregate public schools in the state of Mississippi, and the plan said simply this, and I'm sure many of you experienced it yourself. It said this: parents within a school district will have the freedom to choose where to send their children. Black parents will have the freedom to choose where to send their children. They could be free to choose to send them to an all-white school. But as far as a racist policy goes, without saying anything about race, it simply was brilliant for segregationists, because what black parent was going to be the first to choose to send their child to an all-white school? Very few. But the fact that a few would also allowed segregationists to say, see, there are 2 black kids who go to this high school. It is now integrated. Even though Patterson and others recognized that they would face the same things Meredith faced once he entered Ole Miss. Violent repercussions, ostracization, resegregation in their schools, and their parents would face violence themselves, loss of jobs, income, sometimes kicked out of the houses they lived in. But a shift in policy, a shift in rhetoric away from hardline racist extremism, but towards a policy still meant to maintain white power, but in many ways much harder to tackle. As far as Patterson and his position goes, those hardline bitter enders had to wait for the upcoming 1963 election to attempt to unseat the Attorney General, and the Citizens Council, upon the advice of Ross Barnett, handpicked a young state senator from Rankin County as their candidate. A guy named John McLaurin, who some of you may remember, came from a respected family, was a member of the Sovereignty Commission, and had been president in Oxford for the riots as an official representative of the governor. And fresh off the Meredith saga, Patterson was locked in the toughest political fight of his career and ultimately would have to withdraw from the Citizens Council because of their support for McLaurin over him. And ultimately, Patterson emerged from this chaos. This is his official portrait that was in what we call the Mississippi Blue Book. Patterson emerged from the chaos and would go on, and you can read about it in the book, to defeat McLaurin, of course, in that election. And he emerged from the trials of that bitter campaign, and he did win in a relative landslide, which was surprising for the name recognition that McLaurin had and the support that he had from both Barnett and the Citizens Council. He emerged to offer a more malleable version of white power than the most strident advocates of Jim Crow. As his sister, Doug Haynes, later detailed to me in an interview, and I believe Doug just celebrated her 95th birthday.
She said she was 95 on 95.
All right. His sister Doug later told me that white voters in Mississippi re-elected Patterson over McLaurin by such a large margin, in part because they recognized that the Citizens Council and its ilk was going to soon fade. Quote, it was just a means to an end to try and keep putting off integration. And I think everybody knew it was going to end. In her mind, the failure of the council was that it was too, quote, demanding and never willing to budge or change its tactics. On the other hand, Patterson knew that segregationists had to flinch in the face of a federal government determined to see its authority and international reputation upheld. And we do have to remember the context of the Cold War and the fact that the Soviets were using our racism against us, especially in third world countries in Africa. You think that they're supporting democracy, but they don't support democracy for their own citizens of African descent in their own country. All of that, I would say, was thanks to the grassroots modern civil rights movement in Mississippi. And as Patterson was quick to point out, in the Meredith affair, he knew that one chink in the armor of Jim Crow did not mean that the entire system was defenseless. And over the next 6 years, he stood at the forefront of a consistent, conservative, and effective political effort to erect more subtle obstacles in the path of the ever-advancing civil rights movement. I would say that Patterson's story also should help us debunk notions of the exceptionalism of Mississippi as compared to the rest of the United States. That supposed exceptionalism, as I mentioned before, allows others to point their fingers at Mississippi for its backward and dogged racism, while ignoring and glossing over what is an American problem with racism, not just a Southern problem. As for Patterson, he was at the forefront of developing a political philosophy built upon those supposed colorblind notions of politics, all about racialized power, which appealed to and was adopted by a growing national conservative movement in this country, seen in what would be Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, a strategy in the Republican Party at least, that dated as far back as Herbert Hoover and what Herbert Hoover called his Lily White strategy. Instead, American conservatism of the 1970s and 80s emanated from the grassroots level like the civil rights movement did, especially in the South. Civil rights movement histories have largely ignored Patterson's story. I had one person who read this book and who said, why would anybody want to read a book about an attorney general? Right? I hope some people will want to read the book. While this volume uses Patterson as a lens to look into the evolution of white Southern politics and resistance in particular, it serves, I would hope, more as a collective biography of white Southerners like Patterson who recognized that a more nuanced response to the movement than that of diehard segregationists was necessary. In addition, it examines the widespread and diverse nature of practical segregation, a term coined by Earl Johnston when he was director of the Sovereignty Commission. Patterson represented a viable political alternative to line in the sand resistance at a time when many historians have claimed that such options were non-existent in Mississippi. And Patterson expressed a political and social ideology that was not so exceptional after all. This alternative framing does not mean that Patterson advocated the advancement of the modern movement or even stopped resisting it. To the contrary, he continued to fight for Jim Crow and against civil rights activism for the rest of his life and would die in office in 1969. White Mississippi was never monolithic, still isn't. and Patterson's opposition to the Ross-Barnett camp grappled with the dilemma common to white Southerners. Ultimately, Patterson and many others saw his position as the best option for maintaining Mississippi's social and racist order. Most white Mississippians came to agree with him. Together, they resisted the movement without the systematic threat of violence or absolute rejection of federal court orders. In addition to reducing hardliners into much more than what Hiding Carter would once call in an editorial yapping dogs, it was Patterson's version of politics that is an intransigent brand that was never defeated. Thank you. Saved about 10 minutes, I guess, for questions.
Did Mr. Patterson have any involvement with the Medgar Evers assassination?
In the sense, I mean, he wasn't involved with Byron-Dale Beckwith. No, I mean, he certainly supported the defense, and I mean, was not directly tied to it. The thing about murder is it was tried in the local courts, right? And those local juries were both two times that they tried them in the 1960s were resulted in hung juries, and Patterson wasn't involved in that part of it.
What happened to, what was his response when the 3 young men were killed in Philadelphia?
His public response was a lot like the rest of the public responses in the state, and that was he initially claimed it was a fraud and blamed Northerners. But the thing that we know about Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney is that, and remember, Patterson was a part of the Sovereignty Commission and supported the mission of the Sovereignty Commission his entire career. The one thing that we do know about the Sovereignty Commission, and he was an ex officio leader on it, was that it was Sovereignty Commission information funneled to the Neshoba County Sheriff's Office that gave them the license plate tags so that they would know who to pull over and who to arrest the night that Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney disappeared. And of course, they would then be turned over to the Klan from the Neshoba County Jail.
Did he rejoin the Citizens Council after?
No, and in fact, I think one of the biggest surprises for the family was that he had ever been a member of the Citizens Council, and in fact had distanced himself. He had to very far from the Citizens Council because of the opposition that he faced after the Meredith crisis and John McLaurin's campaign.
Is your next book going to be how things really haven't changed?
We're going to wait a second before I write the next one.
What was the relationship between Mr. Patterson and Governor Coleman, 56 through 60, and did that relationship change after Coleman went to the Fifth Circuit?
Patterson and Coleman had been friends for a very long time. In fact, Coleman was working in Washington, D.C. when Patterson was on Pat Harrison's staff, and they would live together for a moment in Washington, D.C. During those years. So they had known each other for a very long time. And the brand of segregation, that kind of colorblind politics, was something that Coleman certainly espoused and was more in line with, and came down that kind of trajectory of Pat Harrison and Coleman and Patterson and others, as opposed to the Vardaman, Bilb, Barnett brand. So they had known each other for a very long time and very close. And I don't know what year that Coleman gets appointed to the Fifth Circuit, but Patterson dies in 65. So Patterson dies in 69, and they're definitely friends up through his death. So.
How about the other colleges after that? Well, who was the next college that did it, and how long did it take before the other colleges?
Well, there have been efforts, I mean, all over the South to begin desegregating. You pretty quickly see the other institutions in the state of Mississippi begin that. I don't know if it was Mississippi State or MUW that was next. Of course, maybe the most tragic case of the entire civil rights movement was the Clyde Kennard case at USM, and what would lead ultimately to his death in prison. That's literally another book that's out there.
Where was that?
At USM.
In Southern.
At Southern, at what was then Mississippi Southern College. Clyde Kennard was attempting to transfer to Mississippi Southern, actually from, I believe, the University of Chicago, and they wouldn't allow him to transfer, of course, because he was African American, and he would ultimately be framed for supposedly stealing a bag of chicken feed. And that would lead him to being imprisoned, and while in prison would develop cancer that would go untreated, and just on his deathbed, Ross Barnett decided to let him out of prison. And so a tragic part of the story there.
The two deaths at Ole Miss, were they students or?
Now, one was a journalist, and the other was another man who was there and was in attendance. But it's amazing that only 2 people died when you consider the amount of violence that happened on that campus that night, and the complete lack of any kind of police presence. Yes, sir, in the back.
Just a comment to follow up on this statement. The more things change, the more they stay the same. You made a comment about the state not realizing it was part of the state. You didn't have that feeling.
Well,
Something about power.
and I would generally argue that the evolution in kind of the majority politics in the state is something that was never defeated, and that the people who are in leadership positions in the state now, particularly the white, right-wing conservative politicians, are direct descendants of this policy and of these people, or were themselves architects of that policy, because we certainly aren't that far removed from it.
I think these books are very important that the truth be shown on Mississippi. But do you understand that not everybody sees Joe Patterson as someone who acted bravely? He was actually neutralized and
I agree.
probably took steps to protect his survival and the survival of his family more than anything. Because people continued to be violated and harassed.
And I don't argue at all that Mississippi all of a sudden became a non-violent state. Certainly violence continues to play an important part of the story in Mississippi, and civil rights activists were taking their lives in their hands, and there are activists today who take their lives in their hands for the work that they do across the state. I simply would argue that the version of politics becomes the dominant version of politics. But yeah, I agree with you, and I certainly don't argue that. So yeah, so.
Professor, was there ever any allegation that Joe Patterson, acting as an attorney, as the Attorney General, as a lawyer, was unethical professional?
Never.
Because and I was going to elaborate, sometimes you got a duty to represent your client, and a lot of times we have awful clients.
Yeah.
Including the state of Mississippi or Ross Barnett.
One of the most confounding things in this entire project and the research was that everybody who came into interaction with him came away respecting Joe Patterson. And I mean, even when I interviewed William Winter, who is, a hero, I think, to most of us in this room, Governor Winter really had, you could tell, a deep abiding respect for the man. Yeah, that part of his career in life was never in question. But I would say he was a product of his times, right? He was a segregationist politician in Mississippi in the 50s and 60s and supported the Jim Crow regime. And we have to remember that he did that. And you could argue, I would say, that stance was in fact unethical, right? It certainly was. But in terms of actually the details of how he conducted himself in his office, that was never a point. Yes, sir.
Would it be accurate to say that what you've been describing here has metastasized to the majority of the current U.S. Supreme Court? I'm particularly thinking of Chief Justice Roberts' statement that he didn't like to talk about what race, and the way not to talk about race is not to talk about race.
The question is, has this metastasized to the current U.S. Supreme Court? I would say yes, but remember, in American history, the Supreme Court has always been, except for the years of Earl Warren, the most conservative body by far of our 3 branches of federal government. That is the same body that decided Dred Scott, that is the same body that decided Plessy versus Ferguson, and Williams v. Mississippi, which upheld the Mississippi Constitution of 1890 that was created for one thing and one thing only, and that was black disfranchisement. And so a conservative story about the U.S. Supreme Court, other than a very short window of time, and even then, I mean, we get Brown in 54, but then you get Brown 2, which says that Brown should be implemented with all deliberate speed. And the thing I try and get my students to do is define deliberate and speed, right? Well, in Mississippi, that meant 1969, 1970. In the middle of the 1969-70 school year, the Supreme Court finally forces in Alexander v. Holmes the desegregation of our public schools. And overnight, in January of 1960, 80,000 white students leave our public schools in a state of about 2 million people. And you know, we wonder why public education in the state of Mississippi is in the situation that it is now, right? It is certainly a part of that history. So, but more directly, yes, I think they represent that same type of political philosophy. But that's, to talk about the Supreme Court as being a conservative arbiter is not a new story. That is an old story.
How did you choose Joe Patterson of all of the players?
That guy right there, his son Bilb. It literally came, I mentioned this at the beginning, as part of a Christmas party. We got to know each other. He said, I got this box of stuff, would you like to look at it? And I said, yes. And I came to hold on to that stuff for the better part of the next 10 years or so. Ultimately, at some point, I'm guessing there are people in this room right now who would like to see a session to state archives.
Who's got the box?
He does now. I get back to it.
I've got the box. I got it back in a remarkably organized fashion. The only thing that I told Robby at the time was, I said, here's the deal. You can have it, you can use it, you can get it back. I need it organized, and you got to tell me what's in it, because I'm never going to read it.
Well, and I mean, the reality was that box was the tip of the iceberg. And I mean, the research that I had to do here was a significant part of the rest of the book. And really, the State Attorney General's office files are so rich, and you can dive into that. You can find out so much there. And then the other two places really for the research were the Kennedy Presidential Library, because that's where all of the then Civil Rights Justice Department files are, so you can go and see the correspondence there, and then the National Archives in D.C. and the Library of Congress. Dr. McElvain, you had a question.
You were mentioning the juxtaposition of the Cold War with the Civil Rights Movement, and I'm sure some people are aware here, but others may not be. I just want to mention it, that roughly 2 weeks after the events at Ole Miss is when word was brought to President Kennedy that U-2 spy flights over Cuba had found missile sites being built by the Soviets, and President Kennedy's first words out of his mouth were, "Can they hit Oxford, Mississippi?"
And the reality is that for the Kennedy administration, as you well know, Dr. McElvain, is that they had to be kicking and screaming into a defense of civil rights since 1963, before he gives his civil rights address the night Medgar Evers is assassinated in Jackson, 3 years into his presidency. And that was of course all about the fact that he needed Southern U.S. senators to support his foreign policy. So, and whenever I tell my students that, you know, most of my students at Jackson State grew up in a house where you have Martin Luther King, John Kennedy, and Jesus hanging on a wall, right, all next to each other. And so you really see a light bulb go off. I know we've run out of time, Chris. So.
We have, but there are books here. Robby's going to stick around for a while, come take him and talk to him.